Okay, as it's 10 o'clock in the UK, or on the hour for everybody else, wherever you are in the world, welcome to day 5. As Ross has said, we've got a number of different things to clear today. And what we're going to do first is take any final comments on the formal minutes of the December meeting and the March check-in meeting. So just check members whether anybody wants to raise before we finally approve those. Okay, so I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I take it that we've approved both of those. So without further ado, John, if we can move on to your paper on the approach to the next stage, the limited scope update. What I've asked John is, I think this is a relatively straightforward paper. I probably shouldn't say that, that tempts fate, but there's 3 relatively clear recommendations. So what we're going to do is just walk through each of those in turn. If you can get the slide up, John, just to remind us on the first one.
Yeah, bear with me.
If that's causing problems, let's just
is the screen share?
No, I think John, just put the slide down and we'll just walk through the paper recommendations in turn, because that's all the slide does. So yeah. If you start sharing your screen.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm having a few problems with enlarging at the moment.
Yeah, well, if you stop sharing, and then I can just see whether people have got any comments on the recommendations in turn.
Okay. Yeah, the recommendations in paragraph 2.
Yeah.
Of agenda item 8.
So if we can take recommendation 2A, that the topics in the next stage of the project should be grouped according to the chapters of the framework to be updated, which is 3 and 5. Any disagreement with that proposal? Okay. So recommendation 2B was that we should consider service potential in addition to the issues originally identified in the approved project brief. Everybody okay with that? Todd, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I read paragraph 5 and it was coming across to me as if we've got a real issue here, and from my recollection of working through this, I wonder whether it's more just a matter of clarifying what we mean, because I think there were some different views in terms of perhaps what we mean by service potential, but I don't know whether I'd describe it necessarily as a big issue. I think it's more a matter of clarity.
Yeah, if I could respond to that, I don't think it is a big issue, and the intention is to bring a paper to the board in June on this. Now, I don't want to get into the detail of that, but certainly at a conceptual level, we're talking really about modification of wording rather than anything deeper. So that paragraph may talked about some of the issues which have been raised at standards level, and that may have led to the view that it's a bigger issue than in fact we think it is. So we'll get back to that in June, but thanks, Todd.
Yeah, it may even be as simple as changing one word without getting ahead. Okay, but it seemed a good idea, particularly as it had come up in a couple of contexts, both in leases and in measurement, that we should just take the opportunity just to fix that. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to clarify. So I'm looking at the table on in paragraph 7. Is that, John, what you mean by the order of the topics? Definition of asset, definition of liability, unit of account.
No, it's not the order. Service potential will be looked at. The impact of service potential will be in the definition of an asset. Basically, service potential is not directly referenced in the definition of an asset, but it is in the definition of a resource. So all I'm doing in that table is just listing the key issues according to chapter, and service potential is an add-on to those we're already looking at. But that's not the sequence that service potential will take in the finalized amended chapter.
So Ian, I'm happy with what that's saying. I just had a question around prudence and the time frame for that, because that could be bigger than we think. Certainly the ISB took a long time and went backwards and forwards on that. So I'm just worried about how much time we think that might take.
Well, it basically depends on how in-depth the board wants to go on that, because if you look at the way in which ISB clarified things, unless the sector-specific issue, then there's a number of wording clarifications which could usefully be included there. If you really want to really go into this, then yes. But I think the question is actually, is there really an issue? And from a stakeholder point of view, if the clarifications are helpful, we don't need to do anything more than that. So, as ever, we can make a real meal of something, or we can actually deal with it in a relatively quick manner. And that's really, wait and see, basically.
Yeah, that's fine. So if John brings a proposal to us in June, let's see what that is. But let's keep it simple. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that will be the first paper, Mike. Now, if things go smoothly, we can deal with it in June. If the board says no, we want further analysis on this, we will bring a further paper back in September. A slight tweak when it comes to materiality, because I think at the moment, both Ian and I think that we definitely will need 2 meetings to address materiality. So there's quite a bit of flexibility around prudence, given that we're going to have the initial discussion in 3 months' time. Thank you.
Okay, and then the third recommendation is that work on capital maintenance and concepts of capital should be taken forward separately, with the timing to be determined. Potentially, they may, that work may relate in if we decide to go ahead with the work on financial performance. But going back to your previous comment, Mike, that's certainly a more significant and potentially wide-ranging debate, and that's why the proposal was that we should deal with that separately. Adrienne.
No, you've heard me on this before. I just wanted on the record that I do think it's important that we do deal with this, because I think it's going to come up. So it's written here that we will take it forward separately, and I think it's important to take it forward separately. From the discussion on the work program, it's not clear whether we're going to do this, and I just want to say I do think we need to do it. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrienne. Yeah, Ross, if you can pick that up, because obviously there would be a scheduling impact on the work programme.
Sorry.
Okay.
Noted.
Yeah.
Any other comments from members? Todd and Patricia.
Thanks, Ian. Just while we're on sort of the work program, I note that we're going to be having probably some reasonably substantive papers and the need for debate on about 4 topics in September, and currently the work program suggests that we'll be approving an exposure draft in September, and I think if we're going to be dealing with substantive issues,
because I'm not on work program generally,
okay.
Just literally on the limited scope update. So if we can come back to that when we discuss that topic. Okay, so members
Patricia? Ian, was Patricia, you mentioned Patricia, Ian.
Yeah, sorry, you put your hand down, Patricia?
Yes, I hand out because my question is about the, okay. I agree with it's necessary more time to discuss the concept of capital maintenance, but I think it's important to define when, but Adrian said about this. But my point is the capital maintenance is related more to measurement decision than the presentation. Maybe it's not the best way to deal with the capital maintenance with the performance statements. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. I mean, I think we will need to look in more detail about what the financial statements, financial performance project might look like, because it certainly does underpin financial performance if you look at that and where gains and losses go and the nature of gains and losses and so on. And that's why we need to explore that before we take any decisions. So, you know, that's the idea, that we, you know, we just need to actually give ourselves the time for that at this stage, whereas the other things are actually potentially relatively contained, and that's the reason for including them in that second stage, but for moving that capital maintenance into the third stage. That's okay. And it probably would be a precursor, but we need to have a look at timing. Okay, so I think we're content then with the recommendations there. So John, we'll look forward to some first set of substantive papers for the June meeting.
Yeah, that's fine. So that will be service potential, materiality and prudence on the agenda for June. Okay, thank you
Okay.
for the very clear decisions.
Okay, that's good. Thank you very much for that. Ross, I think we move on to the updated IS26 project brief. Is that the next one?
Yes, that's correct. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you. So yes, so we sent the project brief through yesterday. Apologies for not getting it to you sooner. It was a bit of a quick turnaround as it was. I've had some comments back from Mike and Renee. And I think the most substantive one was the emphasis that has been put on multi-employer plans, that they actually think that we should actually de-emphasize that, because IS26 does not only apply to multi-employer plans. We understand that they are important, but they just felt that there was a imbalance there about that emphasis. So I'd just like to get any board reaction to that.
Renee.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So yes, so the emphasis in where you had added it, but also probably adding something following at the end of section 2, maybe following 2.6 to address the issue that we articulated last week, which is an issue of transparency and accountability in multi-employer pension plans. The pension obligation doesn't show on anyone's financial statements. I thought that was the gist of it last week. The fact that for multi-employer pension plan, the issue is exacerbated, or the need for IAS 26 is exacerbated. So if we wanted to articulate that, it could be a separate paragraph after 2.6. Thank you.
So Renee, what you're advocating is that probably after 2.6, we add that context, which is around the significance in terms of a consolidated balance sheet for government. And that, you're right, that was something we discussed, which isn't there at the moment. So that's the proposal at the moment. Lindy, are you on that?
Yeah, thank you, and I support that decision. Just my recommendation is when you write it, it's not just multi-employer plans; it's also state plans. That's also discussed in IPSAS 39, where there could be specific state plans that are also they're not recognized in government's books. Thanks.
Mike.
Thanks, Chair. So yeah, I agree with what's been said. The focus for me is the state plans, or the state defined benefit plans are by far the biggest component in terms of the amounts on the balance sheet. But I worry about the use of the word consolidation, because we don't consolidate our retirement benefit plans, or what are they called? We only consolidate the unfunded component. So the entities that are set up to run these schemes or plans are owned by the members, therefore they don't get consolidated, not in my jurisdiction anyway. So I worry about use of the word consolidate.
Well, I think we can draft around that, because I think basically what this does is to identify the liability that needs to be pulled into the consolidated financial statement, which, back to Renee's point, otherwise that just disappears. So I think we can we can get a paragraph drafted that makes that point and makes it clearly in terms of the fact that it's the liability, not the scheme itself, which is consolidated in. So I think that's the instruction there, that we need that additional para that makes that clear, and I think it will certainly strengthen the brief, because it very much underlines that public sector issue. Okay, so can I just, Todd?
Are we taking other issues with the IS 26 project brief now or not?
To walk through section by section,
okay.
And I just pick up. So can I just be clear that we're not looking for minor changes in wording? Those can be dealt with afterwards. What I want to do is just walk through section by section and pick up any issues of principle. So we've already got that additional paragraph in at the end of section after 2.6, addressing that comment from Renee. So if I can just take any comments on the part 1 introduction, which is on page 1. Okay, so then if we can move on to section 2, rationale for projects, and we already have that additional section that's going to go in after 2.6. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. So 2.1 is accurate in the sense that it's just an extract from what's in the strategy and work plan. But we've now decided this is an adaptation project, not an alignment project, and the reference to mixed groups and private sector leverage isn't helpful, but I don't know how to change it, because this is just an extract from the strategy document. But we certainly aren't going to be looking at mixed group consolidations, for example. It's just not relevant.
Okay, well, I'm sure we can fix that bit of drafting. You're right. I mean, it does pull out of the plan, and what we've done is we've moved to adaptations. So, but I think a lot of the rationale still stands. So I think we just need to, there's a bit of finessing that's required there to sort that. Okay, so we have those 2 changes on section 2. Anything then on section 3, financial reporting requirements? Okay, so then we move into section 4 on project objective. Mike, you're on section 4.
You're far too quick for me, Chair, I'm sorry, but 2.4 is saying statements, further elements of these statements are not relevant. I just worry that whole second paragraph is confusing me. I'm just not sure that it's adding anything. It may be true, but do we need it? The last sentence says retirement benefit plans receive contributions these contributions not revenue at the same time pension benefits not expenses. Yeah, look, to me, it's just there's too much information there.
So you're proposing deletion of 2.4.
The first sentence is right. The rest of it, I'm not sure. I mean, IPSAS 1 requires preparation of financial statements. Some are not relevant to retirement plans. Well, that may be true, that may be not. We're just jumping ahead of ourselves, that's all.
Lindy helps out with this.
I think it's described in the issues later on, so perhaps we can remove it from here and just make sure that whatever we're trying to address in the issues under section, I think it's 5, we capture the problem with how the information should be presented and what should be in the statements.
I think that's so we delete 2.4 as is. Okay.
Well, just this, the latter part of it, the further elements that describes the issue can be discussed in the issues and not in the general section.
Okay, so that addresses your point, Mike?
Yep.
Okay, so we're deleting the second half of the paragraph from further elements. Okay, so section 3, short section, financial reporting requirements. Section 4, project outline. Mike, are you on section 4? Are you and Mike on section 4, or are you? No, okay. Lindy, section 4.
Yeah, and I think it's just paragraph 4.5. It has been edited, but I wonder if we actually need it, because it does, the preceding paragraphs talk about what standard setters have done and what we propose to do. And then I actually don't understand what we're saying in 4.5. Also with what we've changed, I don't know what novel issues that won't emerge either. So I wonder if we need paragraph 4.5.
Todd, I'll take your comments and then see whether anybody objects to the deletion of 4.5.
Thanks, Ian.
Just to make the comment that the project brief doesn't have to cover absolutely everything. It's really just making sure that this is a general description of what the project's likely to include. So it may well be easier, as Lindy is saying, for example, that we delete some bits of text if it's causing us problems at the moment. This is, you know, it's only the brief, it's not the project itself. So Todd, then Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. In section 4, I think the project objective needs to deal with the fact that we will be addressing some issues or providing clarity on points that I don't think is reflected through we take an IFRS and then we reflect the unique aspects of the public sector. I think we're a little bit broader than that here, because we do know that there are issues to be addressed or clarity that is needed through this process. So I'd just like to see some words in the project objective, which are then probably reflected in paragraph 4.10, that acknowledges the issues and the clarity that might be needed here. And when you actually get into section 5, I think we are pointing out some things that are in that space. So I think it's important that we're clear that our objective here is to address those as well as reflect public sector.
I mean, could we just say there, you know, it's modded to and modified and supplemented, because I think that would then, you know, address the point that we're going to add guidance as necessary. So if we just add that, you know, and supplemented when necessary, and then that's the point.
Yeah, so long as there's some tweak there. I think it is an important point though, because it isn't just taking IFRS and dealing with public sector. That's my main point.
Yeah. Okay, Mike.
Thanks, Chair. So I'm also on 4.1, and I agree with Todd, but I think my main point was the project objective is to develop an IPSAS, not to develop an exposure draft.
Sorry, Mike, say that again.
The project objective is to develop an exposure draft. I would have thought our objective is to develop an IPSAS.
Yeah, so we just need to delete that reference. So to develop rather than, so delete an exposure draft. So if we delete exposure draft, that proposes an, and then that just becomes to develop an IPSAS.
Yep. Okay.
Right, so on that, we're deleting that reference to the exposure draft, and then we say in later on to address Todd's point, guidance in the IFRS is modified and or supplemented when necessary to reflect. Okay. Now, Lindy, we're back to your point on, does anybody disagree with deletion of 4.5? Okay, so I think that's gone. So then we move on to section 5, outline of the project. And this is where Joe's added in reference to some of the key issues that were raised in the earlier discussions. Obviously, the list is not exhaustive there. Let's just try to reflect those key issues. Renee.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So for issue number 3, classification of contributions, IAS 26 is not silent on how contributions are classified. I think that IAS 26 is clear on where contributions should show up in the statement of change in net assets. So I think that the point that was raised last week about the fact that currently among preparers there is confusion, I think that confusion gets addressed by the introduction of IAS 26. So personally, I don't necessarily, I'm convinced that this issue needs significant attention. Maybe it's to clarify it in the BC, but I feel IAS 26 is pretty straightforward on how contributions should be treated. Thank you.
Okay. Lindy or Mike, are you on that point? Mike, I'll take you and then come back, Lindy, to you, Lindy, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I've got a comment on 5.3, but I agree with what Renee is saying, but I do know in our Australian adaptation of IAS 26, we did make that much more clear, Renee, and we concluded that contributions were a liability and contributions by members were not revenue, and payments to distributions to members are not expenses. So if it's clear in IAS 26, that's fine, but we made it more explicit in our adaptation of that.
So addressing that point, what I propose is that we just keep that's the sentence to say this project will consider whether, and then it is necessary to provide additional guidance. So we delete the first half, Renee, which I think addresses your point, but still leaves it sitting there and addresses Mike's point. Okay. So you fine with that, Mike? And then I'm going to take Lindy and then come back to you. So Lindy, your point.
Thank you, and it's linked to the whole objective of supplementing it, and it's not quite coming clear that when it comes to the measurement of the liability and the measurement of the assets, we might point to or point to additional guidance that is in our existing literature. So it's not just about the options that we might eliminate, but it might also be that when it comes to the liability, we might say, well, use IPSASB 39, that will give you more guidance on how you would measure it if there's changes in the plan or curtailments, etc. So I don't know if we just need a general statement somewhere that will deal with that, or if for both of them. And I can try and provide staff with that, but I do think it's not just around just eliminating the options, it's also about giving additional guidance on how you would measure these things, either by pointing to a standard or including it in the standard. Thanks.
Okay, so you're proposing an additional sentence which would sit somewhere in that section on measurements of plan assets. People okay with that additional general reference in there? Okay. So, Mike.
So, Chair, I'm on 5.3, which got a bit wordy for me. The fourth line talks about such as retirement benefit plans for non-employees. I don't know what non-employees meant, but then it goes on to talk about broader scope issues, health plans, life insurance, benefit plans, and so on. I just want to make sure we don't confuse non-employees with other schemes and those schemes that have already been dealt with in social benefits.
I think the question is back, Mike, in terms of this is a project brief, not a standard. Is there anything that really causes you a problem, or can you suggest deletions that would help just?
So I would, if it is me, I would say such as retirement benefit plans for non-employees, for example, and then the ones that have been listed in the next 5 or 6 lines, because that's then illustrating what we mean by non-employees, because I don't know what, otherwise something's missing for me. That's all I would do.
Okay, anybody object on making that into bullets then? Adrienne.
It's just a question. I don't think the retirement benefit plans for non-employees are the same as in the non-retirement plans that are being talked about subsequently. So I wasn't sure what Mike means there. I don't think they should be linked.
So I would, Chair, if I could respond, take out such as retirement benefit plans for non-employees, just finish the sentence with that or not, and then give the other examples and make sure that we're not crossing over with social benefits.
Do we need anything after not? Can we just delete the rest of that paragraph? Okay, so we delete the rest of that paragraph, which gets us out of that that problem. Okay, anything else on section 5? So section 6 then, describe the implications for any specific persons or groups. Section 7, and the timeline's been extended by a quarter. Mike.
Sorry, Chair, I'm going to hold you up again. I'm on 6.4, where there's a reference to GFS. So any differences arising between GFS and IPSAS can be addressed. Like I just can't think of what those will be. I don't know how GFS accounts for pension schemes, but maybe that sentence is going to spell that out. We'll find out.
Well, I think that paragraph is permissive rather than anything else. So I don't see that it really causes a problem. Ross.
Yeah, I think maybe instead of can be addressed, make it can be considered. As we always consider what the GFS says when we look at things, and we'll update the tracking table and the GFS dashboard for wherever we get on.
Good, thanks for that suggestion, Ross. I see support for that. Okay, so moving on then to section 7. Mike.
Chair, sorry to keep coming in, but 7.3 just needs to stop after ED. The initial output is expected to be an ED. We may find after doing the ED that we don't want to go any further. I don't want to preempt what might happen.
Okay, so we delete the rest of that sentence. Okay. And then section 8. Resources required. And then finally section 9, useful information. Lynn.
Sorry, it was just on section 8, and maybe we discussed this last week, but I don't recall it specifically. So we're now saying a task force is required. I just wondered what the role and the rationale was for that.
So the rationale for that is that there's a number of jurisdictions that have experience of using IS26 or an equivalent. And so the idea is that that experience needs to be brought to bear in staff deliberations, and the task force is the most convenient way for doing that, out of the main board session.
That's helpful just to understand that. Provided that's not going to delay the project, I think that does make sense. Does that mean that we've got the resourcing right then in terms of the staff? If a task force is going to be involved, I guess I had perhaps imagined it might require more on the staffing side as a consequence than just a 0.1 extra.
But it's also an additional quarter. So Ross, back to you.
Yeah, normally whether we have a task force or not has no bearing on the staff resources. Basically what it means is we'll be engaging with the task force on the board papers before they get to the board. So the task force will look at the various issues and how we've dealt with them. And in particular, since we're looking at various national standard setters and adaptations they've made to IS26, we thought it'd be useful to have those offline before we have them at the board with the parties who are interested in this and have dealt with it. So I don't think it's should impact the staff resources. We'll have to critically manage the project to make sure we get the task force discussions in before the papers are finalized for the board. But I don't believe that the staff resourcing needs to be adjusted any more than it already has.
Thanks, Ross. Okay. Any other comments on the brief, Renee?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I have to apologize. My head is kind of slow this morning. Can I take us back to 5.3 where we decided to delete almost the entire paragraph to address Mike's point? I feel we've deleted a bit too much. I think it's important to keep the fact that in some jurisdictions, some standards have been developed with a broader scope. And then the very last sentence, then we can delete the second last one, but keep the last one, that this project will consider whether these other benefit plans should be included. I feel some of the logic of the paragraph gets lost if we delete the entire second half. So I would keep those two sentences, but delete everything, the rest.
Ross, you on that?
Yeah, I would just say I think we should have a small editorial group for those who have detailed comments, because I find when we do the drafting in the meetings, sometimes we lose things. So I would propose that those who have a lot of comments have a look at the draft once we've approved it. Because what I'm hearing is for most of the points, it's tweaking to drafting rather than points that are missed or substantive items that are wrong. So I think specifically to Renee's point, I'd be more comfortable if Renee got a look at the drafting after this as well. I think it was Mike who had the original point, just to make sure we capture the final points and we don't have to spend time writing in the meeting.
Yeah, and again, that goes with this. I think the question, this is a project brief at this stage. It's not actually, this won't go anywhere near the guidance. It's actually just to get the project moving. So, we don't have to have, it doesn't have to be perfectly crafted. It just needs to actually be a good articulation of what the board is looking for in this project. Okay, so we have got a number of edits, but I don't think anything changes the thrust of what we're now looking at. Joe's reflected the fact that this is now an adaptation project, that we're going to bring in experience from national standard setters, and also I would add from international organizations. UN system has been wrestling with implementing this, and I think having reported back to them that we will be going ahead with this project based on the discussion last week. I did a presentation to them yesterday, and the guy involved that's been wrestling with received the news with acclaim. So they see it as good news and they're major users of the standards. Mike, and then I'm going to just ask for approval on this.
I'm being flippant, but invite him onto the task force, Chair.
I don't think that's flippant, actually. I think we should. And I think he would only be too happy to do that. I think it would be sensible in terms of the relationship with the UN system. Scott, and then I am going to ask for approval and we move on.
You're on mute, Scott.
Ian, are you talking about Carl Soul at the UN? He sent me an email. He definitely was impressed with, he used to work for me. He was definitely impressed with your conversation. So I did want to pass it on.
That's great. Thanks. Well, he was literally beaming on the call yesterday that we picked this up because it's given a major.
I would support Mike's comment on that. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, right. No, I think he'd be only too happy to be involved in the task force. Okay, so we do have a number of edits to deal with, but I think we're now sufficiently close for us to ask for approval to proceed on the basis of the project brief. So if I can ask for a show of hands, electronic hands, from those members that are content that we approve the project brief subject to those edits. So if we just hold that for a minute.
So I've got 13 hands, 14 hands, and 2 thumbs.
So is that 16? So if we go, anybody disagree? Sorry, anybody not approve? Okay. Anybody abstaining? So do the numbers add up there, Ross?
I'm going to ask Leah. Leah, is someone not here today? Because I've got 17 for and 0 and 0.
Nima is.
You're right.
Yeah, okay, she's back. She's back.
Nima, can I ask?
I'm here, but my raise hand button doesn't work. I don't know what has happened.
So then we have 18 with Nima, so everyone approves.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Great. Okay. Well, I think that's important. Certainly there are a number of issues there, and I think we've now got the direction right on that going forward. So thanks everyone for the input on that, and thanks to those members in advance who will help us to polish that off in terms of the drafting. Okay, so Ross, then in terms of the agenda, we are moving on then to decisions and instructions, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct, Ian. And for the decisions and instructions, everybody should have received an email with the decisions and instructions overnight. I'm not going to put up on the slides the actual decisions and instructions. I propose we go through them section by section, and if there are any points, members can raise them, and I'll bring in the appropriate staff to discuss if needed or to take down what the amendments are. So with that, if everyone has their document open, the first item in the decisions and instructions is the item we just completed, IAS 26. So that's page 1 of the PDF. And just to note that the instructions in that section are the points we've just cleared. So this should read the final decision, approve the project brief subject to edits. reflecting members' comments. That will be the only item that'll remain.
Then,
So am I, just to be clear, are we taking comments on page 1 at the moment?
we're on page 1 on the IS26 item on page 1. So we're going to move.
Decisions and instructions, you mean?
Yes, but we're going to move topic by topic through those. So we're just on IS26 at the moment.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Okay, so then we move on to IFRS 8. Okay, so we move then into revenue. Lynn.
So I had a couple of comments on the revenue. So the first one is on the first decision at the bottom of page 1. Just as worded currently, it implies that we've already made a decision to continue with 2 standards. I know that was our sort of working practice at the moment, but it read to me more of a final decision. So I wondered if we could use something like revise the working title or something, or just sort of tone it down just slightly in that decision there.
I'd suggest then if we can just put brackets around the S's so that we make it revise the titles, brackets S, of the proposed revenue standards, brackets S. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I've got a couple more on the next page. Do you want those now, or do you want
just check whether that addresses Todd and Mike, or are they on the next page?
No, I'm on the page 1 as well, and I think we need to be clear that this decision that we've made, that we want to do that late in the process. So we don't want a paper coming back, say next meeting, on the titles. That's going to be something that will be near the end of the process, just to be clear.
Yeah, I mean, there is an instruction to staff which goes with that, which is actually, you know, recommend amended titles when all key decisions have been made in the project. So you need to read the 2 together. That's okay, Todd. Mike, are you on 5.2.2? Okay, so if we move then on to the remaining decisions on page 2, so this is through to agenda item 5.2.8, and then I'll move on to the instructions after that. Lynn.
So my first one is on 5.2.5. And I do agree that we agreed to retain revenue from performance organisation obligations as a separate type of revenue, but written like that, it didn't entirely reflect that you could read into that means we're going to have it as a standard on its own. I think we recognised that it had characteristics of a separate revenue stream. And what we've got here is retaining it as a separate type of revenue. I didn't want that to imply that I was agreeing that that should be in a standard on its own.
I don't think it says that. It literally just says that we recognise. I mean, we can say we can recognise
within the standard with a brackets S on the end would be.
I mean, look,
for me,
you know, virtually everything could be contingent on everything else. If, you know, as it stands, surely that is actually factually correct.
It is, but we're not the only people that read these, and I do want to make, you know, I stand by my point that I think it, whilst I can see that it's a separate type of revenue, we also made it clear that we felt it was a subset, which is the next point.
Well, I mean, you know, I think we've got, we've got to get the right sense here, and we can't caveat absolutely every decision. Now, Todd, have you got a suggestion for us on this?
I'm wondering whether we can deal with it through a slight change to 5.2.3, because that's where we say that we've made a decision to continue to present revenue guidance as two separate standards. And I think the decision, as I remember it, was for the time being, we're going to continue to present it as two separate, but it's still an open debate that is coming later as to what we do here is the way that I remember it. So perhaps we could put at the beginning of 5.2.3, for the time being, we will continue to present them as two. And then when you read things like 5.2.5, it would be in the context of, for the time being, we're doing this. So that would be my suggestion. That is one of my points that I was going to raise with 5.2.3, and it might help in terms of Lynn's point as well.
So,
and then I do have a number of other points I want to raise within this section, but if others are on this point, then they might want to come in before me.
So, Lynn, with that qualifier, are you content that then all the others can be read in that context of for the time being?
I think it's helpful to add the words for the time being. I think it's important.
Okay. But we do, I mean, just to underline, we do need an operational way forward on this. So if we can have that as for the time being, and then we will come back when we've actually got things in front of us rather than dealing with concepts. That's really what we're trying to do, is actually find a way forward on this. Okay. So the proposal is that we add for the time being before 5.2.3. Okay. Right. So Todd, I think back to you for your additional points, and then I go to Mike.
So in 5.2.4, the first bullet point, I am not sure that that's quite right, and it's where we start talking about the at least one present obligation. So if we've got a binding arrangement, in my mind that means that there are rights and obligations, and you've got something that's enforceable, but the obligations that you have within a binding arrangement, when we talk about obligations, it doesn't necessarily translate that those obligations will equal the definition of present obligations, in my mind. So I think we just need to be careful with the way that we phrase that.
So have you got a proposed wording for that, Todd?
I could come back to staff with a proposed wording for that.
Eileen, can I go to you, just because I think does this not pick up what the proposal was in the paper? Can we have clarification on that?
Yeah, so the decision, the wording itself is actually based on what we proposed in the paper. And now, Todd, I do recall that you mentioned during the session as well that we should double check how this aligns with the conceptual framework. So it does tie in there. Now, part of the definition and the way we've described present obligation also goes into what we'll talk about later today, but we do have that note there that we will confirm it. But at this time, because we've considered the concept and we did seem to get board agreement, we've written that as is, and it may be a matter of clarification in how we do the guidance itself in the supporting guidance to make sure that we don't cause any confusion or any conflict with how the framework has presented it as well.
Back to you, Todd.
Right, and the second bullet point in 5.2.4, at the end of that second bullet point, we're talking about the enforceability mechanism being able to hold parties to account, but I think it's more around enforceability means you need a mechanism that gives you the ability to enforce, rather than holding to account. So I think the ability to enforce was something that came through in the discussions that we had. And then the last point that I had was in terms of the decisions was at 5.2.7, and I know this is a tentative, but the way that 5.2.7 is written doesn't quite make sense to me. And again, it's at in the last line. I think enforceability.
Can we come back?
Sorry, what was that?
7 when we've had the debate.
Okay,
Because
that's fine.
I don't think it's fair to other members to draft on that till we've had the debate on that. So, Mike, where is your point? And then I'm going to come back to the first 2 points that you're making, Todd.
So thank you, Chair. My 2 points was similar to Todd. So I agree with his point about enforceable mechanisms. So I'm not going to repeat that. But the first dot point on the 5.2.4, I wasn't sure we had reached that agreement. And I'm also questioning now the reference to at least one present obligation. I did think we should check that to the conceptual framework. And I also think I also said at the time that we should revisit the definition of what a binding arrangement is, because I'm not sure that's now consistent with the definition. So at the moment, and I'm wondering whether that's going to come up again later when we discuss revenue later tonight, because my reading of what we're saying here is we're now agreeing to time-based accounting, which was something we discussed a lot. So I'm not comfortable with the first dot point as it's drafted. Thanks.
Lindy, are you on this? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. I wonder if we should just, in the last part of that bullet, just say that it contains at least one obligation, and then we can in the further discussion, we can unpack whether or not it's a present obligation that you recognize. But there is an obligation on one of the parties, at least in this arrangement.
Eileen, can you come back on that? Because my impression was that the whole point about a binding arrangement was that it did include at least one present obligation, and that's fundamental to it.
Yeah, and this is actually how we present it in the framework as well, where we say that an obligation is a present obligation when it's enforceable. So in this sense, if a binding arrangement is enforceable because of how we've defined it and how we've categorized it, then obligations identified within a binding arrangement would inherently always be a present obligation based on how we've considered it in the framework as well. So in that sense, I think it would be clear if we keep present obligation within the explanation that we have of the principle. And then we can definitely elaborate on it within the guidance to say how we've gotten there and how it ties to the framework.
Mike, back on that.
Yeah, so I'm not saying change the words. As I said, I wasn't sure whether that's what I agreed to the other day, but if it can be clarified that it links to the conceptual framework and is consistent with the definition, then I'm okay, at least for the moment. I want to come back to it later tonight.
Okay. It's not intended as to prejudge the time or any of that discussion, and indeed we won't be having that in detail today. You know, those discussions are for June, so just to be clear about that. Okay, so I think what we have is some clarifications, Eileen, on basically those 2 bullet points. And I think, you know, what we need to do is ask you to work with Todd and Mike, respecting though the discussion that we've already had, to get that to say what the outcome of the debate was, and if necessary, go back to the discussion on the tape. Okay, so 5.2.7, 5.2.8 are clearly open at the moment because we haven't had those discussions there for the remainder of today. So if we move then into instructions to staff, on page 2, we've got 5.2.2 and 5.2.3. Lynn.
So on the very last one on page 2, where we're saying that an instruction is to develop 2 revenue standards based on option 1, subject to a final review after development on whether to combine or not. Please can papers that come back on whether to combine or not consider the discussion that we did have about whether or not we've got the right split between the standards?
I think, Lynn, at this stage, can we just, because actually the fundamental thing is we are dealing with stakeholder comments on 2 exposure drafts, which is ED70, ED71. Nobody said fundamentally they wanted us to reconsider those. So at the moment, all that we have on the table is, do we proceed with 2 standards where we reverse the order, 71 and 70? We've not been asked to fundamentally reopen the structure of the standards. And there was no suggestion that we should fundamentally reopen. The question at the moment has been around a duplication question.
Yeah, my point was, when we were looking at the papers though and having the discussion the other day, we usefully looked at one particular table that I think David drew our attention to, that actually in eliminating duplication, you might end up with a potentially different split, and we shouldn't cut that out as an option yet.
Equally, though, we've not been told that there's a fundamental flaw with it. So I think we have to progress on the basis that we have 2 EDs that we have exposed for comment, and nobody has told us that there is a fundamental flaw in that. So at this stage, given that we're 6 years into the project, we should not be talking about fundamentally cutting these standards in a different way. And indeed, ED71 is actually very closely developed from IPSAS 23, which has been in use since it was approved in 2006.
I guess just to come back, all I'm asking for is that option is considered in the papers. I'm not asking staff to draft on the basis of that option. I'm just asking staff to consider that in the options in the papers that they bring back. If I'm a lone voice on it, I will shut up. But I think I would like that option considered because it may be the easiest way to avoid duplication without changing any of the principles we put out there. If we felt it was more useful for our users, then why wouldn't we consider that?
Because you end up with wherever you put a dividing line, you end up with a problem if you go for 2 standards. So the issue is basically that we tie up a lot of time, we make a fundamental change, and then our stakeholders say, well, actually, this is an existing standard that works perfectly well, so why would we make a change? So I am challenging in terms of where would you put the split?
Well, I think we had the discussion last week that the potential is to put the split at revenue with obligations and revenue without obligations. We did have that discussion in the board last week. And all I'm suggesting is that as an option, even if it's just a pros and cons and why the staff don't think it's the right option, should come back in the papers. I'm not asking staff to redraft on that basis. I'm asking staff to consider whether or not that is a better option.
I think at this stage, I think we're tying up a lot of staff resource in something that may well not improve the final standard. So if we accept that as a proposal, then it comes back when we've done all the other work. Because otherwise everything remains open. And fundamentally, I go back to what we're actually trying to do here, which is we're looking at comments that we've exposed 2 exposure drafts. We've been told that our stakeholders support what is in those. All we're looking at is how we present. So I think the question is really, is there a problem here? And the answer to that is probably no. So, okay, we will look at it in the review when we come back at the end to see if it's 2 standards it remains 2 standards or 1, but can we please keep that until that point in time, rather than keep on having the debate about, well, maybe we could split it in 2 different places, because that is not going to help us as a board to actually move these standards through to finalisation. And I say that because I have been involved in the original development of IPSAS 23, and I've been with this project for 6 years, most of that as chair. So I do know what's going on here. And I would really strongly counsel us as a board to not keep everything open when we haven't been told there's a problem. So we will come up with something that addresses that, but we cannot keep dealing with this in terms of, well, we might go this way, we might go that way. It has to be something that we deal with at the end when we can see what's actually, where everything else has landed. Okay?
So I'm comfortable with us coming back to it at the end. I would note that we did have comments about structure, but I'm happy for us to come back to it at the end.
You've gone mute, Ian.
Todd, then Mike, then Adrienne.
Thanks, Ian. I think it's important in our instructions to staff under agenda item 5.2.3 to be clear that the instruction is to develop the 2 draft revenue IPSASs as standalone standards, because I think we talked about that, and I think it's important to make that reference to as standalone standards here, because it will then make sense what we say at the end of that point, which is about the degree of duplication. And it was because we talked about 2 standalone standards that we could get a lot more duplication. So if we can get the word standalone in that first line, I think that's quite an important point.
Okay, thanks, Todd, for that clarification. I think that's you know, supported by the discussions. Mike, then Adrienne.
So, Chair, I'm on 5.2.6 under the instructions. In that instruction, we refer to, in the second line, where it is unclear.
On page 2, Mike.
Okay, I'll wait.
Adrienne, are you on 5.2.2 or 2.3?
Yes, I am. I just wanted to come in support of Lynn, although I think we're going in the right direction. I do think we had comments on the structure, and I think, you know, my broad view, which is the tail is still wagging the dog on this, and that's part of what confused our commentators. So I want to support Lynn in leaving this open and having the discussion at some stage. Thank you.
Okay, but just to underline, we have switched the guidance so that the first standard that people will hit is the guidance based on ED 71, which is supported by the staff analysis that is the majority standard. So we've already made that switch to address both constituent comments and the communication point and the fact that that's the majority source of revenue. So
yeah, and I think that helps a lot.
Yeah. Okay, right. Okay, so we move on to the next page. And Mike, you're on 5.2.6.
Yes, Chair. So 5.2.6 refers to, in the second line, where it is unclear or too complex to appropriately allocate. I don't believe we should put or too complex because it's not in the instruction. Or sorry, it's not in the decision. So if you look at 5.26 on the previous page, it only refers to where it is unclear. And I think that's all it needs to be saying.
People okay with that suggested change? Okay. So I've got Todd, then Patricia.
Thanks, Ian. I'm concerned I must have been sleeping through part of the meeting when we discussed agenda item 5.2.5, because the first bullet point doesn't quite resonate with me. I think whether it's a performance obligation or a present obligation, there could be a reasonable level of specificity, etc. But the main distinguishing feature for a performance obligation is around the transfer of goods and services to the provider of the resources or to third-party beneficiaries. So I'm not sure whether drafting guidance that says that, you know, it's performance obligations that has specificity, etc., is the right way to go.
Sorry, can I just go back to staff on what the paper actually said? Because we... Eileen, can you clarify for us, please?
Yeah, I'm happy to clarify. And Todd, you're absolutely right. The transfer is very important. Now, what we are proposing here is to not take that out, because I think that guidance wasn't unclear per se, but what constituents were really looking for was additional information on how to differentiate them. And so the paper itself still highlighted the transfer as an important consideration, the transfer of control and transfer of goods or services. What we're proposing here is to add additional guidance to really highlight the nuances on the specificity, and that in general with performance obligations, there's a greater level of objective specificity that helps with the monitoring and the clear vision of the transfer of control. So the instruction that we were hoping to capture here was to add additional guidance to highlight some of the key discussions that were within the paper as well as in the board discussion last week.
In doing that, we're not taking away from the fact that there could be a similar level of specificity where you've got binding arrangements that don't have performance obligations but have present obligations.
Yes, that was a very helpful point within the discussions last week. So this is maybe something we can build into the BCs as well to highlight that the board has discussed this, but we did take that note. So it'll be part of the drafting that comes through in June. But thanks for pointing that out again. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so with that, you're okay, Todd?
I think if the point's been noted and this isn't exclusive, the specificity isn't exclusive to performance obligations, you could have that degree of specificity where it's a present obligation, then I think I'm fine.
Okay, good. Patricia.
Thank you. I think it's similar to Todd because I think it's necessary to identify, it's not to clarify or to better articulate, but identify the characteristics that distinguish performance revenue without performance obligation, or if performance obligation that have implication in terms of account treatment. For example, differences in the application of 5 steps at guidance about revenue with performance obligation. Because I think it's the main issue now, because it's not, if it's not possible to distinguish, maybe it's we need one guidance, because the 5 steps can be used. And sometimes I think it's the guidance is not in the level of principles, but try to address some account recording, for example, when I recognize assets, liability or not. And for me, it's the main issues. The decisions depends on the identify the characteristics that in fact distinguish the 2 types of the revenues.
Sorry, just to be clear, what we're not doing is re-debating here or debating what may come back. What we're trying to do is actually just get the instructions right. So
yes, the instruction
is there something that is unclear in the way the wording, the instruction is worded, or it precludes the debate that you see as necessary?
Yes, I think it's not very articulate, but I think we couldn't to identify the characteristics that in fact distinguish the 2 types of revenues. Then it's necessary to identify and then to finish the discussion. It's my view. The instruction is different, is in a different way than put here in the document.
Eileen, is there anything you can suggest by way of clarification that would help Patricia on this? Because I don't think that was the sense.
Yeah, maybe Patricia, we can definitely connect offline on this, but I guess my first reaction is, as a takeaway from the discussion last week, I think where we were really getting to was that there isn't a silver bullet that's going to differentiate performance obligations and present obligations. It really comes down to that kind of two-prong argument, if you will, that one, the constituents have said that it really is a different type of revenue stream. And also when we went down into the counting of differences, you're absolutely right. In some cases, the step 5 model won't apply to revenue without performance obligations and other types of revenues. But there wasn't one specific accounting difference because it really came down to the terms and conditions within each binding arrangement and the specific nuances that would come out of that binding arrangement. So the accounting itself will really depend on that rather than individually coming from one single characteristic within performance obligation. So staff's proposal on how we're going to take the draft guidance forward is trying to capture the fact that there's multiple things to consider in a sense of both what constituents have told us and what the potential accounting differences would be, but that really it needs to be looked at on a binding arrangement by binding arrangement basis. But we're happy to connect separately, Patricia, to make sure that we've addressed your point appropriately and clarified what you're looking for.
Yes, thank you. The risk here is to enter in, to approach the specific kinds of arrangements, and I think it can be a challenge because it's not the rule here to identify all kinds of arrangements, but the principles that can be used can be apply when recognize and measurement the arrangements. Yes, but thank you. I connect with you.
Okay, so just remembering this is instructions. We're not redeliberating or writing board papers here. So if we just clarify to make sure that that doesn't cause a problem. Okay, so then I think we move on to natural resources. And the decisions on natural resources. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. So I'm on the top page, the first, and the decisions. So the decisions section is quite short, whereas the instructions to staff are quite long. And I was trying to reconcile the two, and I couldn't. And maybe that's because we didn't make a lot of decisions at this meeting. So, for example, we'd already confirmed that sovereign powers in themselves cannot be recognised as an asset. I think we decided that at the last meeting, so there's no need to record that again. I think we also said subsoil resources are a resource as defined in the conceptual framework. Was that a decision at this meeting or was that a decision at the last meeting? I can't recall that it was, but I think it's something we decided. I was just going to make sure there's a link between the decisions and the instructions, and have we got all of the decisions in there?
Lindy or Edwin?
I think we did confirm that they are resources because that was what was written in the paper, but it wasn't a specific question for the board. So I guess we could add it, but it wasn't a specific matter that we asked, but it was just generally, do you agree with how we've written the paper? But I'm happy to add it as a decision.
Look, I think those were two important decisions. The fact that we made a decision about what is a sovereign power and is that an asset in its own right, and then that a subsoil resource is a resource. I think in future it would be helpful if we record somewhere that we've made those decisions.
Ross, can you come back on that, please?
Yeah, well, just to clarify, Mike, these are the decisions from this meeting. So just a quick flip back, we've got in September 2020 the sovereign powers decision that's already there. So we're just trying to get the board to agree to what they actually looked at this meeting and what the decision is. So I don't think we need to record more than what's there. We'll have a look at the resource point to make sure if that hasn't been recorded previously that it is. But I think we didn't make a lot of decisions at this meeting. There's still a lot up in the air. So I don't think we should get ahead of the discussion either.
Okay, thanks, Ross. So it is just the incremental decisions. Adrienne.
So I think this is a small point. In the general instructions, it says revise the wording regarding PFM issues to remind readers that the overall objective is to strengthen PFM. I'm not sure that gets at the comments that people had, and it wasn't me, it came from someone else, but I did agree with them. I think the discussion of PFM in the text, and I can't find it now, had fairly specific recommendations about how to handle how some jurisdictions, put resources in a special vehicle or whatever. And I thought our view was this is a bit too specific and it should be taken out. So even I can deal with this offline if necessary, but I'd like to go back and make sure that what we're instructing here is to take out the stuff that's too specific on the PFM side. I don't know if I'm being clear. I can't find the paragraph.
Yeah, I think what you said, Adrienne, there is consistent with the sort of nature of the discussion. I think it was Adrienne that made the point. And I think actually, if we sort of work on that third bullet to say something like, to make a more general point that.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Fine. Todd, can I just check, we're now moving on to page 4. So I'm on instructions here. Yep, Todd, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. And this is a general point. I know that the decisions and instructions are really important because they form the basis for the minutes. And I don't know whether this lends itself to decisions and instructions, but I do recall that we didn't get through all of the papers under agenda item 6. And I think it's important, whether it comes up here, it definitely needs to be in the minutes that we didn't, but we did sort of say if people had comments to feed those through to staff and that the staff would deal with those separately. So I don't know whether that comes through as an instruction, but I think it is important that we do capture that point and make sure that it's reflected in the minutes.
Thanks, Todd. Yes, agreed. That was an instruction. If we can add that bullet, and Ross, if you can just in the the intro to it say that the board discussed whatever the paper's numbers were, and make that clear.
Noted. Thank you.
Okay. Mike.
So right at the bottom of page 4, Chair, thank you. The reference to the mid-period work program, are we on that?
I just wanted to check we collected all the comments on natural resources first. I'm not seeing any other flags. So yeah, that moves us on to the mid-period work program. So go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Chair. So it was just, I think, under instructions to be more clear about what happened in the discussions at the breakout sessions. I think we should record that there was consensus for differential reporting being the #1 selection. The other 2 or 3 major projects were less clear about what was top. And then under the minor projects, IPSAS 21 came out on top by everybody. I don't want to record everything that happened in the breakout sessions, but there were some key indicators from those sessions.
Ross, can you advise on that? I'm a little hesitant actually to provide a lot of detail because I think that was a brainstorming session and clearly we've got to take the the conclusions away. So Ross, perhaps you can just sort of I'm not denying which came out on top, I'm just how we report on that and Ross.
Yeah, I mean, I'm comfortable with the general description we have because we're going to take it away, the findings, and we talked about comparing against the roundtable discussions we had a couple of years ago on this and kind of doing some depth of analysis to go behind it. So, you know, we haven't had a lot of these sessions, so it's kind of a new territory, but I would be a little apprehensive to be too specific and maybe tie the board down should in June, when it has the full analysis, it wants to make priority changes based on the analysis.
Okay, so you're okay with it on that basis, Mike? Yeah, I mean, it is tricky to kind of get the balance right on this one. Lynn?
So my comment was on the decisions on the mid-period work programme, and the second decision, which reads at the moment, engage as opportunities arise. I thought we had decided to seek to be a bit more proactive than that, and that sounded very passive to me. So I wondered if we could make that sound more active, either by seek to engage in the broader discussions rather than engage as opportunities arise, which sounded very passive to me.
Ross, to you?
Yeah, I would just say, why don't we just drop as opportunities arise and just say engage in discussions around future sustainability reporting.
So that does it for you, Lynn? Yeah, okay. Fine, good. Todd?
Thanks, Ian. I just wanted to check the bottom of page 4 around the instructions to staff. It talks there about a further pre-June board meeting session. I can't quite recollect that. I do know that we talked about the regional groups that we got together for the brainstorming getting together again at some point before the June meeting. And I'm not sure whether there's an instruction to staff there to help organise those regional subgroup meetings, or how that's all going to come about. But if it's not reflected here in the instructions, I think we do need to be clear about how that's all going to happen before we finish this meeting.
Thanks, Todd. So you're advocating for just expanding that slightly to be a bit more specific on that. Ross, back on that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Todd. And I think the last sentence makes it seem like it's a full board session, and what we're talking about is the regional groups reconvening to have their discussion. So I think we need to clarify that a bit. We, just so you're aware, behind the scenes staff are developing a schedule for that. We don't have it fully formed yet. We have our first draft and ideas, but we'll have to come to each of the regional group leaders to get their buy-in on dates and process. So I don't think that level of detail should be here, but should clarify that what we're talking about there is these regional groups reconvening before June for a further discussion.
Yeah, thanks for that, because I think I didn't know whether there was an action for the leaders to take, or whether, yeah, so it's helpful to know that the staff are working on that, and link in with the leaders of those 4 sessions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Todd. Agreed, that's a useful clarification. Okay, so that takes us through, so there's a number of sort of amendments and clarifications, and we've agreed there are certain areas where staff will work with board members just to clarify the wording on those. And then those will come back out. Ross, can you just confirm on process in terms of finalisation?
Assuming everybody's happy with the changes we make on the one-to-ones, I would propose we post those when they're ready, rather than another round of the board.
Okay. Fine. Okay. So move us on then into your update, and then we'll take a break at that stage.
Thanks. There's not a whole lot to update on the work program. Members agreed with the changes that were already reflected in the work program, and the only substantive change from what was posted so far is the addition of IAS 26, including the amended time frame that would now have that ED going out in December 2021.
Yeah, Todd.
I think this is my opportunity to raise the point that I was going to make earlier. So when we talked about the conceptual framework limited scope update, we are dealing with, I think, 4 substantive issues for the first time in the September board meeting, according to the plan, and the technical program director's report has an ED being approved in September 2021. I don't think that's realistic if we're dealing with substantive issues for 4 papers in September of 2021. So I think we need to acknowledge that the ED is likely to be approved at the December 2021 meeting.
Thanks, Todd. Yes, that certainly seems reasonable. Ross, you're okay to make that change?
Yeah, I'm okay to make that change, assuming the board's okay. So I think it makes a lot of sense if we're looking at 4 items for the first time that we give 1 meeting after to pick up drafting changes and finalize.
Okay. Mike.
Yeah, quick one, Chair. The discussion we just had on decisions and instructions talked about developing a project on segments. Does that need to go into your plan, Ross?
No, not until the board actually agrees to add the project and reviews a project brief. So it's premature to do that at this point.
Okay. So any other points? Okay, so with that change to reflect the point that Todd made on the time frame for the next stage of the limited scope update, I think at that stage we take a break. So I'm going to suggest we come back at 2:45 to resume the discussion on revenue. And David, as ever, will keep time for us. Okay, thanks everyone. See you shortly.
1 minute warning.
How are we doing on time, David? Are we?
You're late. I've already rung the bell twice.
Oh, sorry, I was downstairs dealing with something. Okay, apologies, everyone. Okay, so we move now back into the revenue discussion, and obviously we started on agenda item 5.2.7. Staff have actually produced some additional material to support the discussion based on where I think we got to. So perhaps if I can pass back to, is it Eileen, are you going to present, or is it Edwin that's going to present on this one?
I'm going to present on this one. Okay. Thanks, Ian. So I'll start by sharing some slides that we've put together. And so our approach for this session is to really step back and walk through some of the background before getting to our new decisions. So we started from ground zero with the conceptual framework, explaining what a liability is. And when we've looked at the framework, the three most important points were from paragraphs 5.14 to 5.16, which we've quoted here. And so the basic points are: a liability is a present obligation for an outflow of resources that arises from a past event. Obligations that are not present obligations unless they're binding, and there's little or no realistic alternative to avoid the outflow. So, and the last point is for the outflow of resources to give rise to a liability, it has to be unavoidable. And if the outflow is avoidable, then that's not really a liability. So the second point is especially important for what we'll talk about next, because in the framework, it's already inherent that if there is a present obligation, it is arising from a binding arrangement. So I just want to emphasize that. So stepping back, back in September of 2019, the board already decided that, you know, if there is a present obligation with an unavoidable outflow of resources, that would give rise to a liability, or in the context of a revenue arrangement, deferred revenue. Okay. So what we've done is, on this next slide, we've put together kind of a what if scenario of what happens after you have a binding arrangement. And in the very top box, and this kind of reflects what we talked about on Wednesday in 5.2.5, because there's a binding arrangement that's enforceable, we're making the statement that this gives rise to a present obligation, which would result in a liability or deferred revenue. So on the left box, we're saying, well, what happens to this arrangement? And on the left side is the entity satisfies the terms of the arrangement. So i.e. it performs whatever is required. And in that scenario, the entity would recognize revenue. And we're going to talk about the details of how this is recognized in June. But at the same time, it's reducing the liability or the deferred revenue. On the right side, it's really covering the scenario where the entity does not perform. And as a result of non-performance, for there to be an unavoidable outflow, we have to look at the substance of the overall arrangements and see if there's anything that sets out negative consequences of non-performance. And one thing that we've highlighted is that these terms or the consequences have to be set out upon the inception of the arrangement. So it's not something that comes up after the fact. And also the consequences are usually consistent with the extent of non-performance. So a lot of times it's not an all or nothing clause. It really depends on how much of the terms have been fulfilled, and that would drive how much of an obligation is left for the entity to satisfy. So based on the two scenarios, we're coming up with this overall principle that we're recommending. And again, it's not really that different from what we have said in September 2019. And what the staff is recommending is that at this meeting, we're just confirming the principle that the enforceability in the binding arrangement gives rise to deferred revenue or liability to the extent that the terms of the arrangement are not yet satisfied. And so at this point, we're not looking to see, what exactly gives rise to a liability, how it's measured, etc. That will be, we'll bring back in June with a paper detailing all those points for the board to discuss. So I'll hand it over back to Ian to see how the board reacts.
Okay, thanks, Edwin. So really, that's tried to move the sort of thinking on a little from what was in the papers, reflecting some of the earlier comments board members have made. So really open up to the board to sort of comment on that proposal. So I've got Ajith, then Mike.
Thanks, Ian. Listening to the discussions last time, what I felt was that there was two substantially different views that were emerging. One which I felt was based on a statement of financial position approach, or what you can call a balance sheet approach, and another view that came up based on the performance statement approach or a P&L approach. Now, based on the financial position approach, there must be a liability to defer recognition of revenue. And I think that is what Ross also mentioned a little while ago, that that liability should also comply with the liability as defined in the conceptual framework. On the other hand, those who argued in relation to the performance statement-based approach, I think Lynn particularly mentioned that we are drafting a revenue standard, and therefore, in order to recognize revenue, we need to see what is required as revenue, what is more appropriate to be considered as revenue. Then Bernard and Green also mentioned that present obligation needs to be satisfied in order to have revenue recognized. And Mark also mentioned that eligible expenditure needs to be incurred before we recognize revenue. There was also, when I looked at the comment letters sent by some of the comment parties, the New Zealand Accounting Standards Board which gave a very detailed comment letter, also raised concerns about them receiving funds in a particular financial period in relation to several financial periods. And then those expenses are going to be incurred in the future years. And they had also a concern about recognition of revenue based on the financial position approach. Now, what I was wondering was whether, is there a way to recognize and consider both these aspects and see whether it can be done? And my view is that yes, we can. And I think we have done it in other standards. And if you look at the property, plant and equipment standard, the PPE standard, IPSASB 17 says that surpluses on revaluation of property, plant and equipment will go direct to net assets or equity. It doesn't go to the performance statement. Then we have fair value gains in financial instruments classified as fair value through net assets or equity, which goes directly to net assets or equity and not to revenue, not to the financial performance statement. Then we have gains and losses on hedging instruments relating to cash flow hedges, which go to the net assets or equity and not to the statement of financial performance. Then we have remeasurement gains and losses on net defined benefit liabilities on retirement benefit plans, which goes to net assets or deficit and then not directly to the performance statement. So using the approach given in other standards, which we have done in other cases, I think what we can do is to put to the performance statement what is relevant for performance and what we can put to the statement of financial position, what is relevant to assess the financial position. I think in that way, we should be able to provide more relevant and faithful representation of the financial position as well as the financial performance. So I think that might be the appropriate approach which will satisfy both concerns. One, the concern relating to the financial position and the concern in relation to financial performance, because both has to be relevant and both needs to give a faithful representation. So that's what I thought of. That is my view. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ajith, and I'll take comments from other board members before going back to staff. So I've got Mike, Mark, and then Todd.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Edwin, for taking me back to the conceptual framework. I'm very happy with what you presented to us, and I support where you're coming to or coming from. So, and the reference to what we decided 2 years ago, yep, that's helpful. Thank you. So, at that time, I was satisfied that if there was a capacity to enforce, there was an enforceable arrangement in place that could give rise to liability. But I always try to link that to a clarity around what was the performance obligation. So if that's vague, even if there's an ability to enforce a refund of the money, I'm worried that we're going to end up with time-based reporting. So for example, if the arrangement, and you asked me to have a look at Appendix 7, which I've done, and I don't like reference to the word grant, but that's a separate discussion. The issue there is if it just refers to an activity, well, what's the activity? If I'm giving you $1 million on the 30th of June, I have a right for the money to be repaid, but the activity is so vague you can't work out what it is. In other words, just go away and spend the money on school teaching or do some health services. Then I need both sides of the equation to be clear. There's an ability to enforce, there's capacity to enforce, and there's a very clear service that's going to be provided. And I'm not sure that I'm linking the two, or your papers are giving me clarity on both.
Okay, so I'll go to Mark, then Todd, then Lynn.
Thank you to staff for making this clarification and also linking it to the conceptual framework. I think the way it is drafted, it works because it's clearly the focus is on enforceability. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that we, as a global standard setter, should try to set the principle so that the various transactions in the jurisdictions can be applied, the stipulation can be applied to these transactions. And I think the principle as it is really linked to the question that each jurisdiction will have to assess whether the enforceability is as such that there is a present obligation resulting. So whether the arrangement is really binding and enforceable. And I think in this way it works. And what I also want to emphasize is that in the current IPSAS 23, if you read paragraph 17, when it's also talking about the unavoidability of an outflow, I think this is still a relevant paragraph in my mind. I don't think we are too far from this thinking. And I think IPSAS 23 is a standard that worked in practice. But maybe this time we would put more emphasis on the enforceability, which I really think is a key also for determining every transaction. So for me, I'm comfortable with what's proposed, and I think, of course, in June we'll have to have additional discussions in more detail. But for me, as such, the principle works, and it's in line also with the conceptual framework, which was also always a very important point for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So go to Todd, then Lynn, and then I'll go back to staff.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And I think I'm probably in a fairly similar space to Mark. I mean, we're trying to keep this reasonably principled. So if we have got a binding arrangement, which I think we've agreed there'll be a present obligation, and if that is an enforceable arrangement with little or no discretion to avoid performing, then I think, conceptually, I think we can get there in terms of deferring revenue until we are performing what we need to under the arrangement. I do wonder whether we are going to need to have a discussion about what we mean by an outflow of resources, though, and I think this comes up through some of the comment letters that have come back through this process. And I think there are some differences in views around what is meant by an outflow of resources. And I think there are probably some that see an outflow of resources as occurring where you've got a performance obligation, but nothing other than a performance obligation. And I think where we're getting to is we're acknowledging that an outflow of resources can occur where you are dealing with present obligations. And so I think it will be important that we do articulate that and what we're doing here, and being quite clear in our basis for conclusions, if that's where we do land. But I do think there is, we do need to be clear around what we mean by an outflow of resources to take this forward.
Thanks, Todd. So go to Lynn and then back to staff.
So I agree with everything that Todd has just said. And I do sort of see the flip side. So as I just said, the papers take a very statement of financial position based approach, but the flip side, when you take a income and expenditure or profit and loss approach, the reality becomes that you recognize income when you discharge your present obligations under a binding arrangement. And put simply, that is another way of expressing in effect the same thing. What the papers I don't think really cover is some of what Todd's spoken about and some of what Mike's spoken about. So, and what I mean by that is, I think the papers assume that you've got an upfront asset and liability the minute you enter into the binding arrangement. And I'm not sure that's always the case. And I think we need to explore at what point in a binding arrangement do I have an asset and liability? Is it only when I've received the cash, I'm then making a decision to defer revenue or recognize revenue? Or is it when I enter into the binding arrangement that I've then got a receivable and a liability at that point? Well, if that's the case, is that true on multi-year agreements? And I don't think the papers drive us to think enough about multi-year arrangements. And so maybe I'm biased, I probably am, because I've argued it more than once, but when you take a income and expenditure based approach, you end up with a much more simple, when I meet my present obligation, when I discharge my present obligation, I get to recognize income to the value of that obligation. If I've received more than that in cash up front, I have a decision to make about deferring or not. But I think we need to explore some multi-year type examples and some examples where we don't necessarily receive cash up front in order to make sure we've got the principles right in how we express them. And I think we also need to be careful in the language we eventually use on drafting, because once we use words like present obligation and discharging through performance, we could cause confusion with performance obligations. So we will need to be careful ultimately when we draft.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. So I'm hearing that, I mean, I think, I can certainly understand this point about it's how you present it, how you get into it, because there was a lot of this discussion when we developed the original conceptual framework around, was it balance sheet led, was it performance led, and in the end, actually, the elements are not linked to either. And so, as you say, Lynn, at the heart of this is the binding arrangement and the present obligation. Staff certainly, I think, in presenting this, have acknowledged that the outflows point is going to be critical, and that indeed is where a lot of the tricky issues actually lie, as we know around a lot of the comments around eligible expenditure, also, for example, capital grants as well. So clarity in the drafting is going to be important as we go forwards, and that, I think, is we will see drafting back against the principles that we've agreed thus far. That will be the next stage to see how we respond to what our constituents have actually said. If I go back to Edwin at this point, is there anything specific that you want to pick up in terms of members' comments at this stage, or clarification you're looking for?
I think Ross wanted to jump in first about Ajif's point. So.
Yeah, if I could, Ian. So Ajif, you kind of raised an idea that maybe we could have two approaches within one revenue standard, one that focuses on a balance sheet, one that focuses on more income statement, and drew analogies with other standards. And I just caution against us going down that route at this point in time. One, I'm not sure that analogy with options and other standards holds in the same way. I think we'll run into issues with complying with the conceptual framework and trying to take those two options forward. Whereas the analogies you drew with other standards, clearly those options within the standard are in line with the conceptual framework. So I think it's quite a risky approach at this point to try and bring that kind of optionality in that would allow you to choose whether you want to present your income statement first and the balance sheets the fallout, or vice versa within one revenue standard. I'm just not sure that would work, and I think it would take a lot of resources to work that through, and I'm not sure we're going to be able to make that hang together. At the moment, we're still struggling with the balance sheet, for lack of a better term, approach that we've been taking throughout this whole project. And I think if we get clarity on the principles today, that'll allow staff to bring back some of these specific issues underlying the principle and work that up. So I'm a little bit hesitant on, delivering what you're asking for on that point. But I just wanted to make that point before we move past the debate.
Okay, and just to underline, I think the sort of approach that is being taken is consistent with what's been in IPSAS 23. You know, so this develops the thinking, but it is consistent with that, and indeed that's what we exposed. Staff made that link back. So and nobody has said that the overall approach is fundamentally flawed. There's certainly requests for clarification. But I think there's no demand at the moment to really reopen things in quite the radical way that Ajit was suggesting. There certainly is a need for clarification and link, but what we've got at the moment is consistent with the conceptual framework. So I think, you know, the proposal is that we move forward, but we do need to clarify on a lot of the areas that members have raised, and we need to have the discussion on outflows at the next meeting. Patricia, and then back to you, Edwin.
Thank you. I think the discussion is not specific for revenue without performance obligation, but receive upfront, cash upfront is possible in the case of revenue with performance obligation. I think it's more general question. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. I mean, I think that's what Lynn's looking for is clarification that there are a variety of circumstances, and you know, so I think that's a request that we make that link, because you're right, it could apply in all circumstances. Edwin, back to you.
Yeah, so in response to Mike and Todd's point, we will look at outflow of resources. To me, that is tied to the details of what drives revenue recognition, which we will revisit in June. And to address Lynn and Patricia's point, the only reason why we have an example in ED 71 where we get cash up front is because that's the more common fact pattern in the public sector. And in our view, the principles underlying the deferral of revenue will work in both circumstances. So in June, when we come back with more details, we can certainly add in more scenarios of where we don't get cash up front and we perform first. So we can add that in.
Thanks, Edwin. And I think Lynn's point was there that ties in with your binding arrangement. Lynn, back on that.
Yeah, I guess it was just to make sure that when we get more examples back, we don't keep those too simplistic, because I think the multi-year point is an important one to tease out where people are on the principles here, where you might have and I think that's where I can see Mike's just put his thumb up on that as well, because that's where you get into discussions about, do I have multiple pleasant obligations? Is time basis the best way of spreading? And I quite often only get annual cash sums, even though I've got a multi-year agreement. So I do think we need to have that covered off, not just do I perform first and then receive the cash versus do I get the cash first and then perform. I think we need multi-year examples to really tease this out.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt about that fact that we will need to clearly articulate our thinking on multi-year. There is and perhaps staff can go back on this, but certainly the board was clear on its position in moving towards the ED on time and whether how that works. So I think we're going to need to have this conversation in terms of outflows at a simpler level and then extend that into multi-year and so on. What we're trying to do today is get the foundation in place for that. Lindy.
Thanks. And I was just going to highlight that we did have a discussion on it, and specifically with multi-year arrangements, it might be the case that you haven't got a right to those resources, which would equally mean that you wouldn't have any obligation to perform unless it's in that specific year. So I think we do have to bring those scenarios in that. in multi-year arrangements, a lot of that information is indicative because there would have to be an appropriation. But we did have a discussion on this before the ED, and we did make specific decisions relating to this as well.
Okay. Thanks, Lindy. So I think what I'm hearing is tentative support for the principle that staff articulated in the slide. Clearly, there is, further description that's required, and I think for a number of members, although the overall principle appears to work as written, there is a need to explore the outflows in particular, and I think in terms of doing that, the request would be that we start out with the simple principles, because I think overall what we're looking for is a clear approach. That's what our stakeholders have asked us for all the way through. And then having developed and agreed those principles for the simple cases, then we can elaborate to address examples like multi-year, and also I think again also one of the requests from stakeholders was that where you have more than one present obligation, combination of performance obligation and so on, that we need to be clearer in that, but it comes to actually being clear about the principles. So I think if we can build on that, and in taking that approach, if staff can remind the board about the previous decisions that it's made, as they did in the slide, I think that would be helpful, alongside what our stakeholders have said in response to what we proposed. I think in addressing the issue about binding arrangements, I think there was a clear request, and I think this goes to comments from both Lynn and Patricia, that we need to examine the issue around the asset and be clear that there are plenty of examples where it isn't necessarily cash received up front that we need to address. Okay, Lynn.
It was just a request. Could staff send the slides round that they've just used? Because clearly it's updated the papers. It would be helpful to have a copy of those.
Sure. Ross.
Just want to note, we'll post them on the website where we post the slides for the meeting, so they'll be there following today's discussion.
Okay. So with that as the proposed way forward, are people content then to move on to the overall project plan for the project in terms of 5.2.8? Okay, so Eileen, I think that's back to you for 5.2.8. Sorry, Scott.
I meant to do a thumbs up, sorry. Wrong button.
Okay.
Operator error.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So based on staff's detailed analysis, we came up with a comprehensive list of key revenue issues, which we also mapped to the 4 overarching themes that we presented in December. Now, just one thing to note here is that the list of issue papers that were listed in the table in this paper are based on the issues identified from the analysis. Now, in addition to that, staff will be providing additional papers just to present the drafting based on the principles that were agreed upon this meeting, as well as the paper that Edwin mentioned regarding the liabilities discussion we just had. We also received an offline question from a member about what other technical comments would include. So we just wanted to clarify that these types of other papers will really address a compilation of more isolated comments. So in those cases, there might be one comment brought up within 1 or 2 letters out of the nearly 140. And so in those cases, they were not thematic issues. And that's why we've kind of grouped them together in those other type of papers. In addition to this plan, staff are also proposing that now that we've brought higher level key issues to today's session, and their resolution will give us some key takeaways that we will also bring into the transfer expense project. And we're also proposing that the in-period sessions, as well as the task force, will be considered in the next meeting to help us get to final approval in December. So I'll open up the call for comments.
Thanks, Eileen. Okay, I'm not seeing flags raised. Mike.
Thank you, Chair. So I suppose because December is my last meeting, I'd love to see us issue a standard of that meeting, but it's going to be a big ask. So I wish you luck.
Yeah, it's the pleasure and the pain of having so many comments, I think. And also trying, this is tricky because we're trying to issue standards for both revenue and for transfer expenses. And in a sense, actually, that was the tactic, was to try and focus just on revenue this time round, so that we could work out where, if you like, the bigger principles on revenue. And those will help us as we start to think about it from the other side, because I think there are so many instances where you have governments at state or province level that actually receive funds from central government and then have various forms of agreement with lower levels. So this is a real, wherever you go, this is a real life issue. Todd.
Just one small point. When you look through the issues papers that are coming back, there was nothing there around capital grants. And I just wanted to check, is that likely to come up in this other technical comments, or have we got no feedback at all on capital grants from 140 comment letters?
Eileen, do you want to come back on that one before I go to Lucy?
So from my understanding, we didn't have any significant comments on capital transfers. If there were any, it would probably be within that other category. So the comments that definitely got flagged in that general theme, if you will, they were very isolated and relating to very different subjects. So if anything, it would appear there, but it was not thematic.
Okay, thanks. So Lucy.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just want to suggest that when we cite illustrative examples, for instance, in the standards, maybe we can consider circumstances wherein, unforeseen circumstances wherein binding arrangements or performance obligations could not be delivered because of reasons beyond the control of the entity. One example is the COVID-19 pandemic, wherein a number of performance obligations were not satisfied because of present situations. Like, for instance, when projects, for instance, multi-year projects, for instance, which are dependent on availability of funds that would be approved by Congress, for instance. In our case, there are so many projects which were deferred, and funds that were allocated for some projects were recovered by the national government, just so they can fund the response to this pandemic. So I don't know how we can include those situations in the real world situations in the standards that would have impact on recognition of on non-performance of obligations, and therefore would defer the recognition of revenue or even the satisfaction of the performance obligation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So, Lucy, I don't think that what you're talking about changes the principles, but it does challenge us in terms of what we've said is that enforceability in the binding arrangements is really the key on this one, to all things. So I think that's where you can't legislate for all the detail, but you can actually be clear on the principles and how you would approach looking at the assessments. Ross, you wanted to come in on that before I go to Adrienne?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think to Lucy's point, I think the principled approach we're taking actually helps for that, because most private sector arrangements you would see have force majeure clauses and things such as that that might actually make contracts null and void. So I think we should not get too prescriptive in what we say here and make sure we actually take a principled approach that allows people to navigate their own circumstances and requirements of their agreements and apply them. I can see a lot more risks in going the other way.
Thanks, Ross. Adrienne?
May I speak? So I just wanted to follow up on what Lucy said, that what she's saying seems to me a very important example of my underlying fear in all of this, that the definition of binding arrangement will become too broad. And anytime that it's subject to governments making decisions about budget packages or appropriations when you have insufficient revenue, no project commitment is binding. And we would go in the wrong direction if we pretend that it is, because it just won't ever be. So it's just another reminder of the concern to keep the definition of binding arrangements contained and realistic. And when Lucy raises it, I get scared that we're reopening the whole broader issue of recognizing revenue, even if the appropriations aren't safe. So I felt I had to come back on that again. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrienne. So I think this does come back to, we need to set principles. It needs to relate into enforceability. And clearly the pandemic is a, test overarching in many respects, but essentially that is the principle. And I think we just have to keep reminding ourselves that is the principle that we're applying here. Okay, so with that, I think members seem broadly content with how staff are proposing to handle this. Edwin, Eileen, anything else that you need from us today on this?
Not at this point, no.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Ross, anything else from the staff side before I close the formal part of the meeting?
Nothing more from the staff side.
Okay, so I think thanks everyone for quite an important meeting in terms of the fact that we've given approval to the retirement benefits plan, which is clearly addresses an important public sector issue. We've taken the debate forward in terms of the principles underlying the revenue guidance and how we propose that gets taken forward. And then we had a really good discussion on, the sort of early thoughts on how what should go into our consultation paper on future projects to add to the work programme, and confirmed our position in terms of sustainability and the importance we attach to that and how we would address that. So I think, it's actually been a really important meeting. I would thank everybody for the input, and that particularly, not on the screen, but I would like to include the TAs and observers who input to those really good discussions in the regional groups. I certainly hope that you can participate in the sort of return discussion, if you like, between meetings. And I think we should also thank the staff for a good set of papers that have actually supported us in having those discussions. And of course, I couldn't leave without mentioning natural resources as well. I think we've moved that one forward and identified some key issues. So I think thanks everyone, a good team effort. So with that, we'll close the formal board meeting. If we can break for 10 minutes, then for to come back for a short in-camera session, and